I recently got a copy of Plato's complete works, and I thought right now might be a good time to go through them all and make videos about them. I'm not entirely sure what I want as to the purpose of these videos. Plato's dialogues have been written about extensively for the past 2,000 years, so I'm not really going for an exhaustive analysis of each of the dialogues. But I thought it might be worthwhile to go through them all and make videos just on what I got from reading them. Maybe it can be of interest to anyone else watching this and inspire some kind of dialogue with either yourself or with others. I mainly want to focus on textual analysis whenever I can, even though it might not be totally accurate given that I'm reading the dialogues in English rather than ancient Greek. I'm working off of Plato's complete works as edited by John M. Cooper for anyone interested in reading these as well. I think this edition might be the best out there since it involves the work of multiple translators, and Cooper seems like a very conscientious editor and scholar. The first dialogue in this book is Euthyphro, and that's the dialogue that this video is going to be about. This is my first time reading this dialogue. The general synopsis is that Socrates, who's an Athenian philosopher, sees Euthyphro, who's an Athenian prophet, in front of a magistrate's office, which is basically a court. Socrates is there because he has been indicted for being impious, and Euthyphro is there because he is prosecuting his own father for murder. The dialogue starts at this point when they both meet. What's at stake in this dialogue is basically how to find a working definition for piety that does not rely on circular logic. It's not exactly that piety is what we're after. We're not trying to find the essence of piety, but rather, I think this dialogue is meant to illustrate how to find the essence of anything, of any word or concept that we use to understand the world around us. Euthyphro's determination to prosecute his father stems from his supposed knowledge of what being pious means, and he uses that knowledge to prove to himself that his father was acting extremely impiously. But what's quickly apparent to the reader is that Euthyphro's case against his father is actually somewhat weak. The facts of the murder are this: one of Euthyphro's servants killed another servant in a quote-unquote fit of drunken rage. Euthyphro's father then binds the murderer and goes off to find someone to help figure out what to do with him. Thus bound, the murderer eventually dies of hunger since they cannot reach him in time. This event is what Euthyphro is claiming is a murder done by his father and what deserves punishment. From here, Socrates proceeds to question Euthyphro's definition of pious. Essentially, Euthyphro claims that what is pious is that which pleases the gods. And so, because he is prosecuting a murderer, his father, that should please the gods, and so he is pious for doing so. Socrates doesn't find this totally convincing, and the rest of the dialogue is an attempt to find a definition of piety that does not rely on a speciously self-evident definition, the ones that Euthyphro makes. There isn't enough time in just one video to go through every single argument that Socrates makes against Euthyphro, but one of my favorites of the arguments that they have is when Socrates begins to ask Euthyphro questions along the lines of, does something seen have the quality of being something seen, or is it something seen because it is being seen? Now, this part of the dialogue is usually where things get a little tricky in terms of the language, so I'm going to try to break it down a little bit. In other words, let's say there's a thing X. Does X have the prior quality of being something seen, somehow inlaid within it, and so it is thus seen? Or is X something seen because it is being seen? In the first case, X would have the a priori quality of being seen, and this is what Euthyphro is arguing is the case for piety. In other words, Euthyphro is arguing that what is pious is self-evidently true, it's a priori true, meaning it exists within the word itself. In the second case, however, something seen is only seen when it is being seen. So the quality of being seen is only transiently true. In other words, there is no internal essence that something has that causes it to be something seen. There is no attribute or quality that something has independent of the action of being seen itself. These sentences all use the passive voice, namely the object is placed in the subject position of the sentence. but it's still the object. The actual subject, i.e. the one who does the verb, however, can be missing or omitted. With this argument, Socrates is basically trying to come to some kind of a core definition that he can use for the word pious, one that does not involve some kind of a priori meaning, because the a priori meaning, it seems, can basically be defined by anyone arbitrarily, which is sort of what Euthyphro does in the case of prosecuting his father. What I find interesting in this dialogue is mainly how it seems like Plato almost embeds an answer for us in the facts about Euthyphro's father's alleged murder. If we recall, Euthyphro's father doesn't directly murder the servant. Instead, he arrests him by tying him up. By the time the father goes out to find someone to help him make a decision about the murderer's servant, the servant ends up dying from the cold and from hunger because of being arrested the way he is. Despite Euthyphro's indictment that his father did all this, quote-unquote, as being a killer, it should be apparent that this case is not totally as clear-cut as Euthyphro makes it seem. Euthyphro himself phrases the alleged murder by saying hunger and cold and his bonds caused his death before the messenger came back from the seer. Euthyphro's sentence sort of gives us a clue about the actual events of the murder, because in his sentence, the hunger and cold and the bonds are the subject. His father is not actually present in his sentence. The only real basis that Euthyphro has for defining his own father as a killer is that Euthyphro claims to possess accurate knowledge of piety and impiety, and so then proceeds to define him as such, as impious. But it is here that I think Plato embeds some kind of answers to the dilemma posed by Socrates later in the dialogue. If we recall Socrates' use of passive voice in the argument I chose to highlight, something similar happens in the recounted story of Euthyphro's father. It would require an argument to say that Euthyphro's father was the actual subject of the killing of the servant, because he didn't directly do it. Defining his father as a killer requires some work. Socrates' questioning to Euthyphro makes it sort of clear that Euthyphro is a priori defining his father as a killer, which is what Socrates' questions earlier were trying to elucidate for Euthyphro. Is something seen because it has the attribute of being something seen, or is it something seen because it is being seen? Is his father defined as a killer because he's inherently a killer, a priori? Or would he only be a killer if something was killed by him? The dialogue ends in aporia. It remains unresolved. Euthyphro's logic is circular throughout the dialogue, and the aporic ending of the dialogue seems to signal the impossibility of finding an answer for what constitutes a true definition of something like pious. Euthyphro laments during the dialogue that none of the definitions he gives to Socrates stay put. But that might be precisely what the dialogue is attempting to elucidate. The fact that definitions are unable to stay put. We might even ask after reading this whether there is a way to define something without relying on other definitions at all, many of which definitions might be arbitrary. It seems like the answer might be in the negative here. Consider, for example, that all definitions of words in a dictionary involve other words that necessarily had to have been defined prior. It's possible that we can't reach a kind of axiomatic definition for concepts, but the meanings that nonetheless grow from them are still real and workable. And I think that's what's important about this dialogue, is that it's trying to question how we define our own concepts and how we reason for our own definition of these concepts. Now, I think it might be easy to read parts of this dialogue and get lost in the wording of Socrates' questions, but the ultimate root of the questioning here, I think, is important. So I'm going to continue on with Plato's complete works, make videos about each of the dialogues in the book, and hopefully get them out maybe once a week. My next video will be on the next dialogue in the book, which is Plato's Apology.